Dear reader, I write to you under curious circumstances, as I've just found myself set upon a locomotive bound for Bleaker Hall, and am currently standing outside the station. And while I await some transport to its walls, I met with strange uncertainty. You see, I received a letter some days ago, written in wild hand with no addressee to name, save a return address for Bleaker Hall. While many would ignore such strangeness, I found myself compelled by the message contained within the withered paper. The letter simply wrote, Dearest child, your presence is requested immediately at Bleaker Hall. There is some news of your mother and direct lineage. Come and claim what is yours. The letter, as you can see, is direct yet vague, and while many would surely ignore its directions, I grew curious. You see, I was born at Bleaker Hall, and while I walked amongst its grounds as a child, I do not remember my mother, as I was taken from her at the age of 5 and transported from chilly cold to blistering snow, from Texas to New York, where I came under the care of my aunt and uncle, and whose home I now reside. Some 20 years have passed since then, with little word of my mother, one of the unfortunate inhabitants of Bleaker Hall, and soon after no word remained. Worse still, my aunt would tell me very little about my mother, save that she was her twin, and worked as a housemaid, even after emancipation. So you see why I must take my chances with this strange letter. I must go to Bleaker Hall. Dear reader, I have been traipsing about this town, inquiring as to any transport to Bleaker Hall, and each time I ask this of resident after resident, I am ignored or met with strange looks. I was warned by my aunt that the grounds could be found on no map, nor a street sign for guidance, yet its name must hold some meaning, as each town person has such a look about them. I catch it in the ones who look me in the eye. Deep in their gazes I note a fleeting sentiment, one of a quiet amalgamation of pure alarm, then sudden pity. In some I have noticed rage. Regardless of their looks, surely there is some way to get there, as I clearly have received a letter requesting my presence, and so I know someone must at least know of a way to get there. My thoughts were interrupted by the squeaking crescendo of a coming cart, its weighty frame pulled slowly by a lone sable mule gumming at a patch of hay in its mouth. A cloud of dust wisped its way into the air as the animal trudged forward, the rickety cart jostling about as it came to a slow stop in front of me. Peculiar. There is no rider. Frowning, I stepped toward the back of the cart, as surely I could find someone inside, perhaps sleeping the wee hours of the morning away as the mule made its rounds. Strange. There is no one inside. I huffed in exasperation. Who would hitch their mule just to allow it to waltz around unattended? I stepped back to the front of the cart, looking the animal in the eyes as its ears instinctively flicked away black flies, their heavy bodies buzzing loudly in the slowly warming sun. I stepped off the curb, stretching my fingers out to the ears of the chewing animal when it jolted its head, an irritated huff shooting from its nostrils. The mule pulled forward, stopping the body of the cart directly in front of me, its ears flicking back and forth as it looked to me. Reader, I must be going insane. I swear this mule means for me to board this cart. I could hear the iron gates of Bleaker close behind me as a cold chill swept up my arms and down my back. You see, the walls of the entrance were a facade for the rest of the grounds. The warm brick entrance dotted by purple hearts stood in stark contrast from the courtyard, and as I looked around the front of the large house, I could find no sign of maintenance to the grounds. Pale brown leaves were my walkway, sharp and yellowing blades of haggard grass for company. What few bald cypresses remained of the outer edges of the yard were holding on to the last of their maroon needles, their hollow trunks twisting towards the gray, birdless sky. If there was a soul to be found in the big house, they could surely hear my approach. My steps toward the white structure were all but quiet. Yet there was some comfort in the crunching ground underfoot. The air was still, and I will admit to holding my case closely to my body as I ascended the wooden steps of the house, a whitewashed building of lifting paint speckled with hints of brown and gray. While the small steps of the covered porch proved steady, the ceiling seemed in disrepair, with splintering crossbeams of rotting wood exposing hollow gaps of shadow. Yet still, no life seemed to stir about the place. Not a nest of wasps, a bird in flight. It seemed even the cicadas of Bleaker Hall were silent. I inhaled sharply, releasing the air just as quickly, yet as I attempted to knock, my knuckles hovered some centimeters before the door. A strange twinge flowed from my stomach upwards to my heart. What am I doing here? I blinked, my eyes lifting upwards to the ceiling. The question in my mind was startling, as it was not of a philosophical nature, but of the literal sense. What was I doing here? How did I get here? I could remember the mule and cart, the town and train, but were these actions mine? Was it me who brought me here? Dear reader, I am in a state of confusion. I have now called out through the foyer, the living rooms, the dining room, kitchen, and pantries. For fear of intruding on the more private rooms above, I remain downstairs. And yet, there is no one here. The furnishings are intact, though their appearance proves worn and of an older style. I placed my fingers upon the wooden frame of the portrait of a stern-looking man and woman, clearing it of coarse gray layers of dust and grime. I worked my way over creaking floorboards, noting ancient clutter and strange-looking instruments of what I presume were of a medical purpose, but their soot-soaked appearance proved of no recent use. Yet there is nothing but dust in this house. Or at least this half. As I have said, I do not wish to intrude on any residents upstairs, and yet I tell you I have not heard a single footstep. I have asked myself some 5 times whether I could be the victim of a cruel trick, whether the answers regarding my mother were merely a draw to a bored man or woman who had loved nothing more than to trick a person in desperate need of answers, of the truth. I have already shouted out, and have been met with no answer. By some time I think one would believe the house to be abandoned, but what of the chairs? What of the candlesticks, the carpets and drapes? Untouched by man for years, and yet they still remain. There are no broken windows, no signs of defilement or theft. You mean to tell me that not a living soul has lived in this house, and yet its gilded furnishings remain? Are there no hungry transients in need of statuettes to pawn? No animals in need of the nooks and crannies of a quiet room? Dare I ask, are there no forbidden lovers in need of a moment's privacy? Burn. My eyes shot upwards to the ceiling. There! I heard it. A footstep? A scratch? I left the dreariness of the living room, careful not to knock my parasol against the large bookcase, and entered the foyer again. There! I have heard it again. I stepped toward the base of the winding staircase, placing my foot upon the first step. There! The noise again. I removed my foot from the step. Is there a basement here? Surely not. But, reader, I am certain the noise and shadow I have sensed since setting foot in this house is coming from below. The basement of Bleaker was beyond words. Imagine, dear reader, a dank and darkened room, a size comparable to the warmly furnished living room upstairs, yet cold and empty. Empty, save for a few disquieting features. A barber's chair, set with brown and crackling leather, the cotton fluff of its armrests nearly pulled completely from their posts. There you will find straps accompanying the padding. A desk, its warm, worn wood coated in a layer of dust, yet accompanied by vials and glasses, by magnifying glasses and microscopes, their slides still in place with dried drops of rust-colored smears. A miniature globe sits unspun, surrounded by 4 maps, one of Salem Village and its trial victims, one supposed to lead its reader to the Fountain of Youth, one, the 9 circles of hell and Dante's Inferno, and one of the layout of the missing Roanoke colony. 3 leather-bound journals stood stacked, one upon the other, their points perfectly aligned, though years of dust caked them. The final feature was a hulking cast-iron stove, its black pipe twisting its way upwards and out of the brick-walled room. For the longest moments, I stood in frozen fear upon that final wooden step. The noise, I was certain, had come from below, and yet looking around the room, I could see there was no one. No one. Yet, reader, I tell you, I have felt a cold chill upon my back. I have felt a flutter of unease within me. I think I have felt a force at the back of my neck. Like a hand, a slow and deliberate push to the bottom of the stairs. There was a small window at the top of the brick wall, and yet I say shadows danced around the room. First they were small and many, then next large, yet fewer than before, but I tell you, they moved. As I stepped closer to the desk, to its vials and maps, and placed a hand upon the journals, the room had warmed to such a thick and heady air, such a pressure pressed into my ears. I opened the first journal. The pressure subsided. The air began to cool again. But I could not stay. For as I opened the first journal to its center, I found, in blotted ink words, "I have killed another." Though frozen in fear for a mere moment, I flipped to the front of the journal to find the words, "Property of Cyrus E. Bleaker." I had moved on from that basement to find the sun swiftly setting. I had forced my weakening knees up those creaking stairs and into the foyer, my next destination, the rooms upstairs. By the setting sun, I knew it had been some hours since my descent into that basement. How long was I down there? How long had I been confined to that darkened room, frozen in fear of the stove before me, of the strange maps and unsettling journal entries? As long as I could stomach. I had read the contents of the first 2 journals, the writings of a sick man. I insisted that if I were to stay in this darkening house, that I do it upstairs, away from that subterranean pit. And with good reason, I entered a small room, closing the door behind me as I fled to its small, thin cot. The final journal needed its audience, and I wanted to be of comfort. You see, I have reason to believe it is my mother's journal. It is written of a maid of the house and former slave, her words inked into the aged pages. The entries begin at a random point in her life, leaving me to believe much of her story is missing, and as she speaks of laboratory-like observations, I have reason to believe she was instructed to write these entries. Instructed to write her thoughts, dreams, her symptoms. The entries are general enough, mentioning daily duties, interactions throughout the house, old memories of family, and mention of a daughter far away. The entries ache of sadness and longing, and hope for a better world soon to come. But each entry ends the same. The headaches, the nausea and stomach pains. The journal entries end suddenly. I must be gone now. I have felt a shadow following close behind me ever since I entered that basement. I remain calm so as not to give it acknowledgement. As reader, I am not a superstitious person, yet I swear I feel it closer still. What a place for my mother to have been trapped. What a place for any human being to suffer, to bear. If the words of my mother's journal were true, Cyrus Bleaker was no mere enslaver, no mere madman, but a murderous being bent on destruction under the guise of life everlasting. I have to get out of this house. Though I found myself the subject of anxious sleep, I ran from the maid's room at the first sight of blood-red sunrise. It was time to leave, yet I insisted on finding more papers, more journals, more documents to take to whomever may listen, to whomever may help. I do not believe this twisted house has seen a more frantic and hurried escape. I had to get out of that house. I fear my discovery of Cyrus Bleaker's murderous confessions were not merely a moment of fate, but by some sort of design. I held the 3 journals closely to my chest as I moved about the house, searching for any other evidence. That powerful shadow has followed me throughout the house, hurrying when I hurry, halting when I halt. I have found myself shouting out, demanding of it, and still I turned to see its dark, smoke-like frame behind me. It gave me such an air of unease, and my ears would tingle as it followed close behind. Though the stalking shadow seemed to disappear, I found the portraits of the house shaking and moving, a raucous, pulsating vibration occurring underfoot, impeding my tread. I entered the living room, and the dust-covered books would fall from the case, their hard bodies booming against the floorboards. As I neared the door, the sleeve of my dress caught upon a sharp splinter in the door frame, and I admit to you that I screamed, in fear that my shadowy pursuer had materialized and grabbed me. I turned quickly to free myself, tearing my gown away from the frame, and entered the foyer, finding myself suddenly surrounded by other shadows. They were smaller, yet grew larger, and my pursuer would disappear again, its dark shadow overpowered by their bright fog-like frames. They surrounded me, and a sensation of hands moved about my arms and back, pushing me further into the foyer and out the door. I do not remember even opening the door. I do not remember taking those steps off the porch. But somehow, dear reader, I made it out of that house. I seem to have come across another strange sight. As I paced the grounds of Bleaker Hall, searching for some sign of escape, I came across this wooden slab. When walking around the slab, I could see only darkness below it, as no grass grows beneath the decaying wood. As I sunk to my knees to attempt to lift it, it was of no use, as its weight was unbearable, yet I could see a clear groove to the ground underneath. It was a hole in the ground. Why was there a hole in the ground? I swallowed, a pit forming in my stomach as an invisible weight pressed against my chest. I attempted to stand to my feet, only to find that the weight seemed to push back against me. I have felt this force before. It was the same force I felt after entering the basement and my mother's room. The same force that aided me in my escape from the walls of Bleaker. I drew deep breath, releasing the scent of damp earth from my nostrils as my heartbeat quickened. Please, let me go, I breathed. I removed my hands from the slab, placing them on the ground beneath, brushing fingers against the crumbling dirt. The weight on my chest lifted. I returned to my feet slowly, a rush of blood moving from my knees down to my feet. Looking around, I found the sun was beginning to set, yet I knew I could not stay one more day in that house. One more day meant a night of shadowy sleep and strange dreams, or perhaps a night of no sleep at all. One more day meant another day with an empty belly, surrounded by the quiet misery of Bleaker. One more day stranded. My thoughts were broken by a shift in the darkening sky as the sun continued to set, and for a moment I felt the stinging sensation of tears forming in my eyes. I blinked them away as the wind changed, its howling tone suddenly accompanied by a drifting voice. I followed the voice through the thicket, bypassing the iron gates of Bleaker for the dying brush of the outer perimeter at the side of the large house. As I moved closer, aided only by the light of the crescent moon, I spotted a faint light through the wood, the voice echoing towards me. You better get a home in that rock. You better get a home in that rock. The voice was clear, lofty and booming, but clear. Yes, there must be someone out here. Hands blindly outstretched in the darkening wood, I pushed against cypress after cypress, their needles scratching my sleeves, my quick footsteps betraying my every move as broken twigs snapped underfoot. The sandy forest layer was slowly giving way to my boots, yet my pace was slowed by the mounds of granules entering them. But I had to be out of that house. I released a frantic, tired sigh, a warm tear moving down my cheek as I ran closer to the warming light. Poor Lazarus, poor as I, will he die? You got a home on high. You better get a home in that rock. The voice continued. The sand in my boots was proving too much for my slowing legs. I sank to my knees. I could move no more. The wood felt darker, and for a moment it felt like the black of the night was growing closer. A figure, sheathed in shadow, was bumbling in my direction from the right, and as it suddenly came upon me, I defensively raised my arms before my eyes, a startled yell escaping my throat. A burst of warm air struck my arms and face. Shaking, I opened my bleary eyes. The sable mule blinked at me, its gray nose some inches over my head as it stared. "Who's out there, Sal?" the lofty voice called. Jeremiah handed me a second helping of beef stew, the first food I had eaten since finishing my sandwich that first day at Bleaker Hall. I shakily accepted, feeling the warmth of the bowl radiate to the palms of my chapped hands as I leaned back into his chair. "So you found that bastard Cyrus Bleaker's journals?" he questioned. Nobody sets foot in that house these days, not since his death and the things they found in that house. I nodded to answer the question, but took a bite of the stew, attempting to focus on the salty beef and potatoes and broth. As I sat in the warmth of Jeremiah's home, he had told me all I could know about Bleaker Hall. You see, the house is empty, and has been for some time. And while no one resides nor sets foot on its grounds, it's not without reason. The Bleakers had built the house some years after the state's independence, participants in the trade and enslavement of human life. Mrs. Eliza Bleaker passed from fever. This death came with some suspicion, as Eliza was a wealthy woman in her own right, and had left a sum of money to her son. This money was to be inherited by Cyrus, should poor little Elliot Bleaker pass. And poor little Elliot Bleaker did pass, some 7 months later. Then came a brother looking for their sister Eliza's grave. Passed. Then came an investigator inquiring into the brother. Missing. Then came Bleaker's benevolent tinctures. Jeremiah broke my thoughts, nodding as he contemplated aloud. His brown eyes shone in the flickering light of the crackling fire between us. Bleaker took out ad space in newspapers far and wide, toting a tincture to prolong one's life. A tincture so secret its users were to come directly to Bleaker Hall to purchase for themselves. They were to tell no one and bring their payment. The users never got to leave Bleaker Hall. This went on for some 3 years when the ads stopped. Jeremiah thinks this was because the law was on to Cyrus. I think he finally gained his comfortable sum. But he did not stop his tinctures. He merely moved on to new prey, the last remaining workers of the house. Ulysses the houseman, always handy with a matchbox for a candle or a fireplace. The groundskeepers Thomas, Jeremiah's father, and Hector, his uncle. Martha the cook, and my mother, Helen, the housemaid. Martha passed first, then Thomas, Jeremiah's father, and the others would have soon followed had it not been for that final day, that day that Cyrus Bleacher met his match. Ulysses was done taking his tinctures, Jeremiah had explained. He had enough. And with your mama starting to get sick, there was one thing to do. When Bleaker made him follow him down to that basement to fetch more tincture for her, Ulysses gave him a knock behind the knees, and that devil of a man fell to the bottom of the stairs. I had shivered when I heard the tale, knowing I had stood frozen on those stairs. But as with mystery, not much was done after the death of Cyrus Bleaker. An investigation was led, and the journals detailing the effects of the false tinctures were found, yet nothing was done. No bodies of Bleaker's victims were ever found, and while he confessed to their deaths in his journals, no one had any way of finding their families to inform them of their deaths. Due to the amount of victims prior to, during, and after Bleaker's benevolent tinctures, the case was closed, along with the house, in an effort to move on. Ulysses fled to California for fear of the truth of Bleaker's demise reaching the ears of the town's residents. Jeremiah's uncle Hector moved into the home to care for young Jeremiah and his mother, and a surprising thing happened. Uncle Hector wanted to make it right. When Bleaker got closed up, Uncle took your mama in, tried to make her comfortable. Mama died when I was 11, so he and Helen took care of me, My mother died some years after adopting Jeremiah, unable to travel to see me in New York due to her illness from her time on the tinctures. Hector died nearly a year ago, and they both were buried on the plot of land on which Jeremiah lives. Jeremiah gave me his mother's mourning veil, the one she wore to his father's funeral before passing. I took my mother's journal, tearing a piece of paper from it to form into a small envelope, where I took a handful of the dirt of her grave, securing it within the paper and enclosing it in the journal. I borrowed the matchbook that belonged to Ulysses, a handful of purple hearts planted by Thomas and Hector. And though Jeremiah proved hesitant, he joined me in the trek to the brick walls of Bleaker Hall. We entered together, the grass already beginning to turn to a lush green. Out of the dead of winter, into the life of spring, we stood in the light, in the lively wind, and chased away shadow. There is a power that resides at Bleaker Hall, in its rooms, in its shadows, and in its light. An energy was gifted to me from those who set foot in this place before me, and from those who never got to leave. Yet I will not say there is beauty in suffering. The people who died in this house deserve the love, light, and joy we all as beings of this world deserve. Their deaths were meaningless and cruel, and while many have tried to omit or forget, I carry the proof with me. I carry the strength it's given me. I have a relative in Jeremiah. I have my style from his mother. I have the light from Ulysses. I have the purple hearts of Thomas and Hector. I have the mind and love of my mother. And to those who died in this place at the hands of evil, I ask for their strength and energy. For one day the hole in the ground will be filled, and the world made whole again. Until then, I will hold vigil. I hold vigil for those who could not visit Bleaker Hall. I will hold vigil until my dying breath. But somehow, I think I will not be the last visitor of Bleaker Hall.